welcome. My name is Michelle Hart. I am the Assistant Professor of Academic Development at Bakersfield College Delano campus and co-chair of the organization that has made today possible. This presentation today is being brought to you through the work of Bakersfield College Delano campus Cultural and Historical Awareness Program, or C.H.A.P. C.H.A.P first started at the Porterville College campus over a decade ago, and in the fall of last year it was launched here in Delano. The purpose of C.H.A.P is to bring exciting and intellectually stimulating speakers, forums, films, and events to the BC Delano campus. In addition, all of the events are free and open to the public. This program is a wonderful addition to Bakersfield College's initiatives to bring innovative and educational experiences to our students and our community. But it takes work to make these events happen. And while I'd love to take all of the credit, it really is a team effort. Please let me introduce my co-chair, Associate Professor of History and Coordinator of the Social Justice Institute at Bakersfield College, Dr. Oliver Rosales.
Oh, wow, round of applause, thank you. So it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce to you our speaker, Nick Belardes. I've known Nick off and on for many years. I first encountered him at Bakersfield College in the archives. We were deep in some committee meeting when I first met him. I'm going to read to you an introduction about Nick and his work that was written by his fiancée, who's also a writer and a much better writer than I. Though he was born in San Jose, California, and transplanted to Bakersfield at a young age, Nicholas Belardes is a son of the Valley, a poet of the people, a novelist, an academic, and an activist. He's a true Renaissance man in an age of specialists. Belardes has worked as a storyboard artist for the Fremont Street Experience in Las Vegas, illustrated the New York Times best-selling novel West of Here, written for television, print, and radio, and has published Lords, a novel, A People's History of the Particular, a book of oddities, and Songs of the Glue Machines, a poetry collection about working in factories. At the beginning of the social media era, Nick also authored the first Twitter novel called Small Places. He has published many essays that deal with our social condition. You'll find his literary fiction, nonfiction, and poetry in various literary magazines and anthologies where he's written about themes of oppression, including child homelessness, race, illiteracy, media corruption, police brutality, environmentalism, and the struggles of the working class. He also attended and taught at Bakersfield College, CSU Bakersfield, where he majored in history, which has influenced his approach to writing literature that's charged with meaning. His work is, as Ezra Pound says, news that stays news. In an interview with Latino Rebels, Nick remarked, quote, "I believe in the power of the individual, that one person can impact society. I believe in not just the power of story, but social activism and social justice. At a young age, I was yearning to identify myself. Who was I? Am I part of a group of people? I yearned for justice for myself, for others. It came across in my development as an individual at a young age and impacts the core of my writing today," end quote. This strong sense of justice is a thorough line throughout his writings. It's an engine for his work, his purpose as a writer, his legacy. You will hear him speak about justice and how writing can open our eyes to the increasingly obscene and absurd realities that surround us. You'll hear of his struggles against anti-intellectualism and oppression, his love and criticism of his home. He'll show you how to read for power, how writing means seeing, how seeing means discovering truth, and how the truth makes us intensely alive. Please join me in welcoming Nick Belardes.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Bakersfield College, even though you charged me $100 for that library book 100 years ago that I never returned. Thank you for the Cultural and Historical Awareness Program. This is really a cool event to have in Delano. These kind of events, I wish they had 20 years ago. This is really a wonderful and very unique event to have so many awesome speakers. In a story I recently wrote, a papermaker named Vijay tries to sell his wares in the outskirts of the city of Suva on the island of Veti Levu in Fiji. He's Indo-Fijian from the highlands of Namosi, an area where the population is sparse and dotted with remote encampments and shanty towns, including Vijay's mountain village, Wenilotilevu. He tells us that Tasmanian missionaries have ensured him paper will be his fortune. Vijay wants nothing more than to escape the oppression of his past life. I've already worked 5 years in the copper mines, he says. My body can't keep up with the physical demands. I don't want to drive trucks for the Australians. I don't want to blast dynamite or dig cut pits in the Wasoi Valley. Let the dumber generations with the strong backs do the work. I'm a businessman, a paper creator. Vijay's reality is bleak. He can't sell paper, he's really terrible at it, and his legacy is tied to 2 ethnic Fijian girls, sisters whose car will only drive backwards. In a series of events linked with the girls, Vijay becomes haunted by Fiji's island ancestors, whose blessed 100-year-old body parts the sister and Vijay must bring to a shaman. These parts have become spiritual souvenirs, artifacts for the present, and through this story, Vijay, as well as the sisters, cannot escape their oppression, a cycle of poverty, literal death, and dismemberment, the ghost of colonialism. I wrote this thinking I wanted to create a compelling story. I also think there's this other matter, what Susan Sontag once said, a writer is someone who pays attention to the world. A writer is a professional observer. Most people won't think of this story as an allegory for the backwardness of our home. It's set on far-off Pacific Islands. I tell you now, this is a tale of Central Valley oppression that we have all seen. Another short piece of fiction I've been working on is Gaspar, a story set much closer to here. A Latino boy in East Bakersfield is as tough as they come. His great-grandfather was in the Big Red One, a true World War II hero who was a medic and one of the first to treat Holocaust survivors. While Gaspar doesn't understand war, he does understand the violence of this world, the death of an uncle, the incarceration of another, the brutality of stepping out of line in front of the local police, some of whom he knows are veterans of the faraway war in Iraq, one that he may never realize was propelled by the propaganda machine of the US government, its trickled-down schemes, its tugging of heartstrings to support the war, a conflict that never offered a clear objective for invasion or for instilling democracy. Gaspar doesn't come across as understanding oppression. He hasn't yet felt it in his bones. But you, the reader, know it's there. He thinks the drive-bys, stabbings, shootings, and fights on his street are normal. Are they normal? He doesn't understand the framework his neighborhood operates within, a framework of white rule. Soon he meets the owner of a mortuary who strings along a series of racial epithets against blacks, suggesting he may have lynched a few in secrecy. Gaspar then allows a war to take place in his neighborhood. He willingly sacrifices the mortuary, which he interprets as a form of white oppression infecting his community. His comprehension of oppression is skewed. When Gaspar turns on his own cousin Angel, you see in essence how family has been allowed to kill family. At this crucial moment, you realize that something has failed terribly in the system. This isn't just the American way of life in a neighborhood where families sometimes fail each other. You realize this is failure across the board. A monstrous leviathan gathering all in its oppressive swath. This is total failure of community, police, the people who care for the dead, families, education, health care, welfare. What's worse than society crumbling before a child's eyes? Gaspar's longing to one day die will leave him kicked in a ditch, forgotten with none of the fanfare or mourning of the typical American funeral. The truisms in this story not only depict a culture of violence, but a framework of oppression. A framework where all of us in the southern Central Valley coexist, where we rarely protest, and when we do, we often fail to recognize we are part of a society with the wool pulled over our eyes. We are afraid to protest our culture clash with the local government. We are afraid to protest disappearing water, racist high school suspensions, oil refineries, awful air, the inaccessibility of food, poisoned dirt, greedy corporations, and so on. We are afraid to anger our families, our friends, our newspapers, our TV stations. Over my career, I've written a few news stories, a few poems, some essays, some nonfiction, some books. One of which is a novel called Lords. It has taken this community 10 years before I could stand before you and openly discuss some of the ideas found within this novel, so you can see why I'm so grateful to Oliver and Bakersfield College. It's taken 10 years for people to realize that a problem lurks beyond urban myth, beyond what one journalist said when he belittled me by trying to label me as a wild-eyed conspiracy theorist. He failed miserably. He failed because he lacked a fundamental understanding of literature, that there are no conspiracy novels, only novels. He lacks the understanding of what literature can say, as illustrated by Bohemian Austrian poet Rainer Rilke in Letters to a Young Poet, a collection of 10 letters he wrote to Franz Kappas between 1902 and 1908. And I quote, "Things aren't so tangible and sayable as people would usually have us believe. Most experiences are unsayable. They happen in a space that no word has ever entered. And more unsayable than all other things are works of art, those mysterious existences whose life endures beyond our own small transitory life." Writer Andrew Solomon says in his March 11th, 2015 New Yorker article, "The Middle of Things, Advice for Young Writers," he says, "But of course the writer's job is to say those things that appear unsayable, to cloak with language those volatile experiences that seem barely able to endure it." My novel Lords not only is the unsayable, it is naturally a criticism of the unsayable, of those who have attempted to control society here in the southern Central Valley with a system of obtuse logic and systematic and violent oppression. The book evolved in its own manner, not as conspiracy, but as an imagined arc from a bolt fired through the heart of society, that if we were to follow its path, we would find a glimpse of the sinew, the fibrous musculature, the rotting bones, the exasperated, sorrowful heart of evil men at its core, poisoned by greed and a grotesque desire for wealth, power, and control, a kind of power that would cripple you or me or our families without hesitation. The story specifically drills into a humanitarian disaster within the social fabric of America during the years of the late 1970s, though I want to say this isn't a story that pits cops versus criminals on the borderlands of Texas or great American deserts or our vast urban centers, but rather details a conflict a few miles from here in homes and streets, alongside freeways, inside our government and educational centers, in our theaters, our classrooms, bars, salons, dirt fields where the bones of our own missing may never be discovered. For those of you who haven't read Lords, let me give you a rough idea. It's about a disaster still in our midst. It's about children who go off to fight their personal wars of drugs and sex and survival. It's about media control, the powerlessness of children, child prostitution, homelessness, failed education, dust storms, the Central Valley, our cities and towns, ghosts, yoked wolf spirits from a disappeared people, and about an oppressive society that is still crumbling today because of a broken government and a brutal system of illusions force-fed to you and I through things like advertising, racist political and big business agendas, the media, and heavily skewed police reports that have candy-coated the image of this place for more than 100 years. The impulse for this book began in 2003 after I read a series of articles in the Bakersfield, California newspaper. After I received a phone call from a university historian who said, "They just uncovered the biggest rock in the history of Bakersfield." In a way, a huge boulder was kicked over because a cop murdered the assistant DA, and that opened a doorway for me to step in and say, there's something wrong here that goes far beyond a happy little football town or even a few corrupt city council members and county supervisors. Of course, the real victim in the murder of the assistant DA was a child who died, the cop's son, who was a victim of lust, a victim of societal greed, surpassing one gay man wielding his power for sexual favors from a drug addict boy in one too many tangles with the law. But why would I write about such a dark subject? Is it just about saying the unsayable? Perhaps the fog of early morning light draws me. You know the place between light and darkness. Author Sándor Márai, in his 1942 Hungarian novel Embers, describes it best. Night has still not quite ended. Things are still happening in the forest. The nocturnal animals are still hunting, still ready. The wildcat is still on the watch. The bear is tearing the last scraps of flesh off his prey. The rutting stag still recalls the fury of the moonlit night and stands in the clearing where the sexual battle took place, raises his wounded head proudly. In the heart of the forest, the night lives on. It's the moment when something happens, not just deep among the trees, but also in the dark interior of the human heart. For the heart, too, has its night and its wild surges, as strong as instinct for the hunt as a wolf or a stag. The human night is filled with the crouching forms of dreams, desires, vanities, self-interest, mad love, envy, and the thirst for revenge. Perhaps why I wrote this novel is the very reason the character Joey Minstrel comes stumbling out of an orange-brown glow of a dust storm in 1977 as numb and delusional as the man who answers the door, having not only seen a story in the fog of the storm, but having been a part of the near darkness too. Minstrel stumbled up the driveway to Ricky Rawlins' house. Inside, Ricky cursed his soon-to-be ex-wife. He cursed his children, and he cursed the red eye of the storm. He cursed Sundale and the lords for using him. The vision entered his head of them raping him in the smoking room at Sundale's estate in their cursory path toward the destruction of others. He cursed the energy of that group and their power to move across the valley like such a torrent. He cursed their ability to break his will. He thought of all the hands and mouths and the bruising on his nude body as they sweat, and he cried in their ecstasy for his relief and their relief. He looked out the window where the storm cast a deepening orange glow over his neighborhood. In the swirling dust, he thought he saw a dog or a wolf sniffing and scooting up his driveway. Goddamn strays, he cursed. I'll beat any dog that comes up my steps. Just then he realized it wasn't a dog but a boy. What the hell, he said. The boy crumbled against his front door. He opened it to discover Minstrel had fallen into a heap and was covered in dirt. A trail of dirty mucus dripped from the boy's nose. His eyes were caked in grime. Holy God, this storm will kill us all, Ricky said, dragging the boy into the house. Are you the medicine man? Minstrel said, nearly unconscious. You're covered in wolfskin. You're beating the drum. I think what I'm beginning to try to prove here is that a numbness exists in our society. You can't feel the collective asthma from choking in the storm of our own social condition. You can't feel all the murders. You can't feel the forced segregation. You can't feel the police batons of the past and present. You can't see beyond the advertisements that pretentiously say this agriculture or our cities are beautiful or that they're the only beauty we have. You can't see beyond the white lawyers on the billboards. You can't feel the water about to be drained away because of greed. Are we stupid? Is that the cause of this numbness? As Norman Mailer once said, stupidity is the American disease. I stole that line from author Ben Fountain, who spoke at the Catherine Ann Porter Literary Center in Kyle, Texas on February 20th. And I was there, and he graciously sent me his talk so I could embed some of it in mine. In January, his 2012 novel, Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, was noted by BBC Culture as one of the 21st century's 12 greatest novels so far. It's also being turned into a movie. Ang Lee's directing it, and I think Steve Martin just signed on or something. This list also includes Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz, Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, and Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Fountain said in his speech that it's not so simple to just say stupidity is the American disease. He would rather argue the country has seen too many fine and brilliant things to ascribe, for example, the disaster of the Iraq War to simple stupidity. What is our personal Iraq War here in the Central Valley? Is it freedom of language, censorship, racism? Is there an entire storm blowing from all sides? Fountain blames the distractions of the modern age. I really like this. 24/7 technology feed of movies, music, TV, commercials, YouTubes, YouPorns, cell phones, iPods, downloads, sports of all kinds at all hours, celebrity news, right-wing news, left-wing news, texts, tweets, emails, and plain old-fashioned phone calls. He leaves out video games. But I will add Candy Crush and Call of Duty. He goes on to say, I'm not even talking about the potential numbing effects of the wide array of pharmaceuticals available to us for recreation and otherwise. Thanks to mainstream American culture, he adds, I think there's a strong argument to be made that we don't know what's real anymore, that we live in a state of numbness. Here's a great writer saying, we can't feel. What kind of truth has he stumbled onto? And what about the context of the Southern Central Valley when we bring up this idea of no feeling in our fingertips? What else can we add to Fountain's idea of societal numbness? Is it the farming and oil industries that feed our families, that make us not care about what happens to our water, what kind of poisonous sumps surround our countryside, draining into the groundwater? How about the refinery and the factories we all drive by in Bakersfield that at night belches smoke into the sky that you would never see during the day, or the corporate farming and the endless tanks and barrels of pesticides and the abnormal rates of disease associated with them? Have you not seen the defoliants dropped from the sky on cotton fields next to homes? We wheeze and we cough and we moan and we refuse to hold a picket sign. Are we so used to names of business owners, media faces, and oil barons that they have become our celebrities? Do our families need jobs so bad that we just look the other way? What about the swastika still painted on doorways in meth-infested neighborhoods in Oildale, or the heroin junkies strung out in driveways in circles of zombie waste? I've seen them, have you? What is it about politics in the Southern Central Valley that we're so numb to businessmen who oppress workers, the businessmen who can afford to become our paper boat leaders, our strings of tissue-made lantern political bosses waiting to catch fire, waiting to expose the thin wires from which they ideologically hang themselves as they burn? We watch them and we're numb. We act happy when we see them. They're no more than what this valley turns out as fake celebrities. They pay to become our cultural heroes when you, in your youth, play the fool. Perhaps Paulo Freire wasn't so far off in his 1968 book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, when he said, the oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor, let me say that again, the oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. Why do so many share this perspective? Does this not keep a society in a state of oppression? Is this not what happens to poor conservative whites who uplift and vote for Republicans who essentially keep them in poverty with their policies? Recently, I was in a conversation with journalist Jennifer Strange, who lives in the felon-friendly state of North Dakota. It was just a couple days ago. A place Kern County's Country Boy Crips gang calls a second home. She calls this phenomena of the oppressed internalizing of the image of the oppressor the myth of the local pride. She says the general thinking, regardless of the issue at hand, is a lack of activism on the part of the locals. No reason to do it any other way than it's always been done, right? At no time, at least in my life, Strange told me, has this defeating cultural default been more apparent and more dangerous than in the second decade of the 21st century. She goes on to say, unless and until a person leaves and experiences an alternate way of life, most of us, especially in rural areas, are apt to cling to mediocrity. Culturally, professionally, politically, even personally, The status quo, as low a bar as it may be, is kept firmly in place through a process of knocking down anyone who threatens change, whether from inside the family of locals or from outside. We have to be mindful of education too. Oliver's saying, oh no. Freire goes on to suggest that education is often used to pull the young minds into the logic of the present system and to bring about conformity. The better of the two, he says, and I agree, is the practice of freedom, like this lecture, saying what I want, right? So we can deal creatively with reality and participate in changing our world. There was a particular time I became aware of this. I was working for a corporation in 2003. Colin, you're gonna love this story. It was a really awful automation company that made me write paid advertisements about progress in Camisea, an area in the fragile Urubamba Valley of the Peruvian Amazon. There, the construction of a pipeline was cutting off water supplies, which also meant no fishing for tribes of the indigenous Machiguenga people inside the Nahua Cagupacori Reserve. Social and environmental impacts also included deforestation, rise in illness, contamination of water resources, visible fires, oil spills, air pollution, biodiversity loss, drought, loss of livelihood, land dispossession. I could go on. I felt a strong sense of guilt. Did I help do this? Was I a part of the darkness? Was I a part of the unsayable? Does this form of progress resemble the valley? David Hill wrote in an article about Camisea. Isaias Abras Turco is reported to have said that the expansion of the Camisea gas project will put indigenous people's lives at grave risk and serious danger, and that the 20,000 people living in the region are against it. He is also reported to have said that the benefits of the project to date have not reached local people, that the project has made people's lives worse, that corruption is rife, that the company leading the project, plus Petrol, has contaminated a local river, that the expansion has not been approved by the heads of local indigenous communities. We, the heads, we haven't approved anything regarding expansion in Lot 88. They say the study has already been approved, so we ask ourselves, who authorized it? No public meeting has been held, nor one workshop about it. Abras Turco is reported as claiming to speak for 22 heads of indigenous communities in the region and criticizing national, regional, and local government for their incapacity to set in motion development projects. We're overstudied, overdiagnosed. They know everything about us, but not one authority has bothered to carry out works for our benefit. The purpose of my writing wasn't to destroy people, a way of life. It gets worse. And there's a huge irony. Google Justin Berry, and you will find that in 2005, the 16-year-old was working as the web services manager at the very same company as me for ProSoft Technology, a lofty title for a boy hired at too young of an age by a questionable marketing manager who I later lampooned in my Twitter novel, Small Places, as Milt Butterlink. This was right before Barry disappeared into Mexico. He was living a dual life as an internet porn star and then prostitute for wealthy men. The New York Times wrote about him in the article, Through His Webcam, a Boy Joins a Sordid Online World. The following year, he appeared on Oprah. The way the story goes, has anybody even heard of this story? No, shaking your heads. Appeared on Oprah. I'm working with him in Bakersfield. Can you believe that? This kid, this screwed up kid, right? The way the story goes, he was 13 when it all began. An excerpt from the New York Times reads, weeks before, Justin had hooked up a webcam to his computer, hoping to use it to meet other teenagers online. Instead, he heard only from men who chatted with him by instant message as they watched his image on the internet. To Justin, they seemed just like friends, ready with compliments and always offering gifts. Now, on an afternoon in 2000, One member of his audience sent a proposal. He would pay Justin $50 to sit bare-chested in front of his webcam for 3 minutes. The man explained that Justin could receive the money instantly and helped him open an account on PayPal. I figured if I took off my shirt at the pool for nothing, so I was kind of like, what's the difference? Says Justin. He removed his t-shirt, the men watching him oozed compliments. So began the secret life of a teenager who was lured into selling images of his body on the internet over the course of 5 years. What kind of system doesn't put a stop to child prostitution and child homelessness? Especially when there might be connections to the political core of the Southern Central Valley. Ironically, before Barry disappeared to Mexico, before he was hired in the building near Chester Avenue in Truxton as a cover for his corporate client sex game pedophilia fantasies, before he was connecting to his web server in the same building where I was writing ads encouraging the destruction of the Amazon, I received that call I mentioned. It was from historian John Arthur Maynard at CSUB. Did you ever know him, Oliver? Yes, thumbs up. Who in his usual animated voice was eager to tell me the story of the Lords of Bakersfield and that it was in the newspaper. He was talking about murderous gay men who falsely led straight lives, who gave gays a bad name by raping boys, murdering youth, even each other, and by being the leaders of society here in the Southern Central Valley in the various decades of the 70s, 80s, and even in the 2000s. I'm talking about the newspaper publisher, a police commissioner, the assistant DA, many others. So I'm reading these articles that Maynard directed me to, and it hits me. I mean, it really hits me. You know, Ben Fountain talks about the epiphany he had about his novel when he was with his family drinking martinis, watching a Dallas Cowboys halftime show on Thanksgiving that included Destiny's Child and a bunch of drunk-ass U.S. soldiers stumbling on the field. Only I was reading these ridiculous news stories that predated the celebrity sex maniac child Justin Barry. My epiphany wasn't complex thinking of any sort. I just thought this is the most insane goddamn thing I've ever read. It was the same feeling I had when watching the recent documentary on HBO, Going Clear, about Scientology, where we all find out why Tom Cruise is one of the wealthiest psychos in America and a frontman for a corporate religion seeped in humanitarian abuse. While I was at it, I was also having this realization that the blinders had slipped off. That I could see the Southern Valley for some of what it really was. That it was no different from Halliburton controlling monies in Iraq, sending convoys of empty tanker trucks through war zones just to charge some a bill, all while heroes were being made because soldiers just wanted to save the buddy next to them, especially the ones with their arms and legs and heads turned to those pink mists we think are only in war movies. And I'm thinking, right now, still, today, what has the media been doing to us? It's just like Billy Lynn himself, who Fountain says realizes he's in the middle of this very surreal, overamped, artificial reality. Is that what we're in? A very surreal, overamped, artificial reality. I really started to think about child homelessness, child prostitution, drug addiction, media power, our mutual numbness to it. What kind of oppressed system would do that to someone? What if Woody's Toy Circus, you guys won't remember it, where I went as a kid to dream of owning a giant stuffed dinosaur? True, you could see it in the window just driving past on Chester Avenue. I mean, what if government bureaucracy and the city's lone newspaper were all really part of an artificial world? America has turned into a giant strip mall with a country attached, Fountain writes in his novel. What's turning artificial before our eyes? Are we catching today's signs? In Norwegian writer Karl Ove Knausgaard's highly criticized two-part New York Times article, Passage Through America, published last month, he explains America's Viking-like cavernous palace of consumerism. And he says, the store, a Target, was like a great hall. The ceiling had to be at least 50 feet high, and the various sections offering all kinds of merchandise went on for what seemed like a full city block. It seemed almost obscene to buy something so trifling as shoelaces in this giant box. None of this would have been here, I thought, nor the mall, not the parking lot, not the cars. Another culture with another future would have defined the continent. A few passages later, Ove describes his own numbness about his experience in America. He's considered one of the world's greatest writers. And this guy is in America and he doesn't know what to say. I quote, "When we continued north, I felt depressed. What Peter, the photographer he was traveling with, had said about the burning cigarette being the most exciting thing to happen so far on our trip was actually true. If this had just been any old trip, it wouldn't have mattered, but I was supposed to write something about this trip, and not only that, I was supposed to use this trip to grasp something essential about the U.S., perceive something with my foreign gaze that Americans couldn't see for themselves. Instead, I saw nothing, I experienced nothing." See why it's criticized. Through daily experiencing our numbing American society comes this idea of how we treat each other, how we treat children, how society treats us by only caring about the froth on top of the corporate mocha of civilization. And out of all this realization of numbness came the character Joey Minstrel, a 13-year-old boy from the Central Valley who starts turning tricks in Hollywood. I should quickly add the average age of a child prostitute in America, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, is 12, and can be as young as 9 for girls. The real-life Joey Minstrel, his name is Robert Mistrial, so you can see the play on names I used, he was 11. As I mentioned, the book starts in Hollywood. Joey meets one of the lords of Bakersfield who takes him to the valley. He meets the newspaper publisher who preys on him. He meets a male hairdresser who gets framed, raped, and murdered. He sees where his own family comes from. His mother is a prostitute and addict. He sees into the heart of the worst dust storm to ever hit the valley, a monstrous, monumental storm, an apocalyptic maelstrom which is manipulated by the media as sent by God, and they do this in order to sell more newspapers through their puritanical, jingoistic Jeremiads, suggesting some catastrophe was cast down into the southern Central Valley. In the storm, Joey sees his own inverted reality. He sees spirits and ghosts. He knows the real storm is in himself, in the hearts of corrupt men, the people who smile, who say, like Republican demagogues, "I'll take care of you." He understands on a fundamental level, similar to Billy Lynn, I might add, that he's part of a system of necrophilia, the purpose of which is as much torment and sex and death as possible, the end result, pure power, not over just children, but you and me, so that we don't see what's happening, so we don't question, so we don't even ask the ghosts of the missing children or the terrified minds of addicted babies, what's happening here, what's going on? How often do we hear this kind of language from our leaders that everything's okay? Joey doesn't care about the things I would have cared about. He doesn't want a giant stuffed purple dinosaur from Woody's Toy Circus. His fantasy is to have money. His fantasy is warped because the men of society are warped and their illusions are influential. He wants their money. He wants their dreams. Joey is desperate about this fantasy, but he can't take comfort in it. He can't grasp a basic understanding that the fantasy is so perverse that people die at the hands of it. The cost is his soul. The cost is all our souls. Really, the cost is the farmer's soul, the oil baron's soul, the policeman's soul, the media's soul, and because we want what they want, even if we won't admit it, the cost is us. And none of it has to do with reality, because the purpose of the powers of this society is to distort and to sell an agenda, to numb you with the power of their advertising through press releases filled with fake news, billboards selling you weather girls as celebrities instead of poets and storytellers, and marquees covered in city slogans, the big park events meant to appease you when TV and your smartphone isn't enough, so you ignore the workers getting sick in the fields, the homeless children on the streets, the planes in the sky dropping poison, the poor factory conditions, the innocent boy, Ramiro James Villegas, getting his head shot off for probably just pulling his pants up, or David Salsilva attacked with a dog and batons for seeking help for his addiction. These aren't even, I didn't even list guys who are dying in Delano, where you guys live, and girls. Are you beginning to see how one story about child prostitution isn't enough? We need more writers, more radicals, more thinkers, more stories. We need a multiplicity of voices so no one power is able to take over and silence the rest. We need to speak the unsayable and give voice to the silenced. Are you silenced? I recently wrote another novel expanding on my own theories about child homelessness, about a brother and sister nicknamed Sugarfoot and Tender, who live on an island on the Kern River between Bakersfield and Oildale. People really do, when there's water, people really do live on those islands. Their parents have been taken from them. They are alone, more alone than most of us could ever be. The island where they live has a cast of characters. Iquato, an elderly Vietnam veteran, raises miniature horses and goats. The boy Sugarfoot helps him fight off coyotes, although man is their biggest enemy, and not just any man, but the religious leaders of the Church of the Incorporated and the drug and human traffickers who infest the area. They are of a sort perhaps worse than the lords of Bakersfield. Their necrophilia is a disease where men dress in the skins of animals and hide among us as they prey on our darkest addictions. When Sugarfoot's sister is stolen away, we learn that a brother's love will take a boy to great lengths to not only find his sister, but to win her back, even if it's just what's left of her soul. We learn that society continues to oppress the very young, the most helpless among us, but that even a boy, a mere child caught in no man's land, can escape numbness, can see through the veil. So I wrote those books, essays and short stories, even the first Twitter novel in the world. Some are published, some aren't. I've been saying in my work what I wanted to say, that oppression takes many forms, that American society and the society here in the Southern Central Valley is numb, that many blindly accept the societal construct of oppression, that most accept all of the candy-coated ideals put in place by privilege, by race and ethnicity, by the news, by the corporations, by the veil of justice, in a disguise of life as it should be, a false utopia with citrus goddess images and false expectations set in place by those who control. Really, it's all very wonderful that so much of the work I've created is out there in the ether, that it has social meaning, but what does it do? Among readers, does it count for anything more than a good story? Does it have some mysterious function in society? Can the writing I've discussed help us in any practical sense? I once again turned to Ben Fountain's speech at the C.H.A.P House. He discussed Ezra Pound's book, The ABC of Reading, in which literature is defined as language charged with meaning. Great literature, he said, is language charged with meaning to the utmost degree. Ben said, I find myself tensing up whenever the word literature gets used because it tends to call to mind rarefied, Oprah-ish stories of healing and resilience and the triumph of the human spirit. I hate all that stuff. Or fiendishly incomprehensible examples of modern poetry, or God forbid, the deconstructionists, structuralists, post-structuralists, and all the other schools of contemporary literary criticism that drive most of us straight to Netflix. So maybe a more useful definition of literature would be writing that gets down into the real stuff of life, the sweat and worry and guts and sex and pain and pleasure of it, the down in the trenches human tumble that we're all flailing around in. So when we talk about literature or literary qualities, we're not talking about pretty writing or fancy turns of phrase, but rather meaning in the most profound sense. Writing that corresponds to the facts and takes account of all the ambiguity and confusion and trauma of life as we really live it. It's the job of writers, the down in the trenches literary writers, to see things as they truly are and to find the language that describes those things as accurately and fully as possible without sentimentality or a political agenda. That's more for like speeches like this, right? Or a wish to please the reader. Ultimately, a country's language is in the care of its writers, he says. The value of what they write doesn't lie in their politics, but rather in the relative worth of their expression, whether it's accurate, whether it's clear, or to paraphrase Ezra Pound, whether their language is charged with meaning by virtue of its fidelity to the thing being portrayed. As I took a walk a few days ago through downtown Bakersfield, I saw a mess of multicolored trash cans. If some of you are the artists, you'll probably be angry at me in about 30 seconds. I thought, these poor artists, who's going to stop and stare at a trash can? Why are they not rebelling for a bigger canvas? I imagine these awful city leaders and art community leaders saying, give the artists the trash cans, that's all they're worthy to paint. I would have thrown a paintbrush in their face. Such corrupt leaders, I say give the artists the walls, tell the artists to paint the stories of their grandfathers, grandmothers, of immigrants, of the man or woman down the street, paint the tales of the jobs their families once had, of the homes they still live in, the accomplishments they've made. Give them the walls to paint stories of true cultural leaders, past and present. Or are there none in this system that wants us to recognize top 40 country musicians from the 60s and news anchors? Give them walls to write entire passages from books, from speeches, quotes from family members, from voices typically silent in this horribly oppressive valley. Say the unsayable. I walked and shook my head and saw a complete lack of rebelliousness. Instead there was an enthusiastic zeal to be oppressed. Every painted trash can I saw was abstract, was so disconnected from every passersby. Such abstracts exemplify art without purpose. Where are the paintbrushes charged with meaning to the utmost degree? I saw no legacy of cultural storytelling in that body of work. I saw no artwork that could change a life, because not only were artists only given what is lesser than society's breadcrumbs to paint on, they have not been led, and so they are not turning their lens or brushes or words inward. They are not satirizing society. They are not telling the truths that society is afraid to tell. Freire's words come to mind again. This one's a little more complex. True generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. False charity constrains the fearful and subdued, the rejects of life, to extend their trembling hands. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or entire peoples, need to be extended less and less in supplication, so that more and more they become human hands which work, and working transform the world. And so cultural legacies of this valley continue to be lost. Black, white, Asian, Latino. You could break it down in all kinds of ways. I would rather paint a satirization of the city's painted trash cans, illustrating the disgust I feel for city leaders in Bakersfield and how unfair it is that artists are only worthy of trash. I would rather tell a meaningful cultural story of how so many artists have been duped in a city of oppression and privilege by corrupt city government and arts leaders trying to pacify us all. I would rather protest than be a pawn in some kind of false progress like I once was by writing about progress in the Amazon. I will no longer be responsible for cultural loss. I will be a social critic of those. Remember Nosgard I was talking about? When he was traveling in America, he saw alongside the road a 15-foot tall concrete statue of Jesus. And one outstretched hand was a globe. The limbs were out of proportion. The face was so crudely constructed that the entire work seemed to be embodying a child's drawing. What kind of place was this? Ove said. The history of art was little more than the history of man's attempts to represent the sacred, from the animals in the first cave paintings to the dolphin frescoes at Knossos, from the medieval icons to the hyper-realist angels of the Baroque, from Turner's Heavenly Light to Van Gogh's rain-swept villages. Art elevates us by intensifying and densifying the world. Of course, this is true only of good art, he says, the least trace of anything awkward or amateurish, and we remain in our unelevated state. Our reality of blushing, stumbling, idiotic misunderstandings and blunders that the artists of the past century have abandoned the search for the sacred does not change what came before it. It only tells us that they no longer consider the sacred to be a significant subject of investigation, that the vertical axis has been replaced by the horizontal, so that art no longer lifts us up but turns us in. The statue of Jesus was obviously not the work of a modern caricaturist or intellectual toying with the fundamentally childish nature of faith. It has been made, I assumed, in a sincere attempt to represent what is finest and most important in the world, but over the course of the past 2 days, I had seen many images of Jesus, all of them cartoonish stereotypes, yet they must have been genuine expressions of something many people consider deeply significant. The contrast with, say, Russia was striking. Had I been driving there, I would have come across a very different caliber of representations of Christ, given the nation's many monasteries, churches, and 1,000-year-old tradition of icon painting. Throw Dostoevsky into the bargain, and Russian Orthodox Christianity becomes something you could spend your entire life studying, because it seems so close, with its notions of guilt, grace, and redemption, to the enigma of existence itself, touching the core of what it is to be human. When I think of participatory pacification of the people of our society, whether artists, students, factory workers, churchgoers, politicians, professors, all of us really, I'm reminded of a line from my Twitter novel. I guess there's always some idiot Jodie Foster around who develops feelings for the monster, knowing full well the man eats brains. Even so, some do see beyond the surreal, this overamped, artificial world, the Solomons, the Nosgards, the Frieries, the Rilks, and the Fountains for sure. Andrew Solomon says, despite every advancement, language remains the defining nexus of our humanity. It is where our knowledge and hope lie. It is the precondition of human tenderness. Mightier than the sword, but also infinitely more subtle. Remember that writing things down makes them real, that it is nearly impossible to hate anyone whose story you know, and most of all, that even in our postmodern era, writing has a moral purpose. With 26 shapes arranged in varying patterns, we can tell every story known to mankind and make up all the new ones. Indeed, we can do so in most of the world's known tongues. If you can give language to experiences previously starved for it, you can make the world a better place. All I know for sure is that those 26 shapes are what we have to defend our liberty and sustain our hope. In final, I will read to you from my unpublished novel, Big Spoon, Little Spoon, about Sugarfoot and Tender, chapter 13, as inspiration for you to say the unsayable. Sugarfoot has just entered the tent where his sister Tender was taken. He is with a mute homeless woman named Mary of the Andes. She's a mystery herself and wears a big black coat of feathers. Sugarfoot must realize that if he is to ever find his sister, if he is to ever fight back, even as a young boy, that he must wear her blood on his hands. What blood is on our hands that we share when mustering up the guts to speak for those silenced, to say the unsayable? So here's that final scene. Today I have to pull back what I once heard a gray-haired preacher call the veil of God. I open the tent flap that hangs like a blood-streaked curtain. Tender's handprints cover it. The middle of the mattress is soaked with her blood, though there's only a hint of red in the dim tent. The rest is black as goat blood. A dark line glistens in a streak all the way to the opening. Handprints on the door twist in what looks like letters, only I can't read the words. Mary of the Andes tries to get my attention. My voice is calm at first. I know you don't want me to look at what I already seen, I say. There ain't no one seeing this. I have to, so go home, Mary of the Andes. She doesn't move. She wants me to leave. She wants me to be a child. Her face, half in shadows, looks like the whole world just got ripped from under her old feet. Never seen her eyes so sad, so filled with tears. She closes them and listens. Her coal black feathers look like they could catch fire. Go home, I yell. Go home now, this is my kin. There are other words in the blood as I step into the tent, words I won't say as Mary of the Andes fades into summer daylight. She flies away into some tunnel of brightness where only God's angels ever go. Here in the tent are words I can't read, words on the mattress, words on the floor, words on the wall and ceiling. When I stare long enough, words in the air, words in a cloud of blood, twisting upward in a storm rising from the center of the mattress. The twister of blood reaches higher, tears a hole through the top of the tent. It spins and pulsates through the cottonwoods above the island, somewhere I won't ever reach unless I start bleeding too. I fall onto the mattress, half my face in her blood, crying and grabbing at sticky fabric. I smell iron, the ebb of life as blood cells die into themselves, melting into each other, drying on my skin like clay. Dear God, I pray, why you want to take Papa? Why you want to take Ma and now Sister too? What am I going to do? Give me some kind of answer like you gave them preacher folk. Why didn't they all stay in that church building? Tender could have stayed there. I'd have buried her good. I'd have held her for days if I had to. My tears really flow now, mixing with Tender's blood. In the middle of the night, I hear coyotes yelping far off on the river banks. They cry again in the morning. Some nights coyotes stand on the edge of the mainland and howl at the island. Their gray fur stands on end. They growl and bark and yip. I've shined a flashlight into their eyes, seen their anger, watched them snarl and cry all over again. Mary of the Andes says there was once natives here on our strip of forest. They stole spirits from coyotes and wolves long ago by wearing their blood. Says those men wore the spirits in smoke, which clung to them like fog in both winter and summer. Says animal spirits gave the people life, helped them live long in an unnatural world of struggle, where even peaceful men fall and break their necks or get stabbed in the gut with sharp, pointed rocks like the ones that pierce the hides of woolly mammoths and ancient cats. Says there was constellations that only the natives clothed in animal spirits could see. I never understood why them coyotes stood across the river and howled, not until now. I promise, alive or dead, I'll wear this blood and see you, Tender. I'll see you again, I say over and over, and cry myself to sleep in the bloody light of day. Thank you.
I'm going to take the lead here and say just a few remarks and ask Nick a follow-up question, and then we're welcome to entertain any questions from you. For my students in particular, and this might apply to any other professor who asks you to come, you know, I've taught at the UC system, I've been a fellow at Harvard, I've taught in the CSU system. What I can say is what you just experienced was a level 1 lecture, okay? And I know for my students who are maybe doing an assignment based on this talk, what I'm interested in is your reactions to his basic point, that literature has a social function, that literature is supposed to be socially impactful and changing. So I'm going to ask a question to Nick, and we'll hear his response, and then again, you might have your own question, but here's my question to Nick. You know, my students, Nick, I grade their writing, and I teach history. One thing that my students struggle with, some of whom might be in this room, is finding their own voice. Finding their own voice. What is it that you have to say about history, why it matters, and what you find historically significant? So as a writer, I'm wondering what you can tell this group of undergraduates, many of whom are first-generation college students. How do you find your voice as a writer?
Stop cheating. Man, I was a high school cheater big time. When I was in high school, I always cheated. So that's why I like to pick on people about that. You know, finding your voice is very difficult. It took me years to find my voice, but even I went to Bakersfield College. First I went to Bakersfield College in the mid-'80s, and then I went again in the early '90s, and then having taught there is cool, but when I first went there, I was probably like a lot of you. I was probably, you know, oh, I got to learn to write because maybe my high school teachers didn't really teach me to write, or I didn't apply myself in high school. So for whatever the reason, maybe your high school is a long time ago for some of you, I don't know. But sometimes in separating high school from college, like I put no effort into high school, but college I put in an effort. And so writing is like anything. It's like if you're gonna dig a ditch and you want to put that hole in the ground, you have to put an effort in there with a shovel, right? So it's really kind of simple. In finding your voice, you have to put an effort into writing a lot. And some of your professors might make you journal or things like that, where you're just kind of like writing a diary to yourself and you're writing thoughts about the world. So you have to be aware of the world. Remember what I was saying about Susan Sontag at the very, very beginning of this lecture was about Susan Sontag saying that we're observers of the world. So you have to observe the world. You have to get outside your circle of friends. You have to get outside of Delano. You have to, as much as I slam the news, I have worked for the news, and you have to read the news. You have to read literature, news, history. You have to start exposing yourself and writing your opinion of it, even if it's just to yourself. And that's a really great way to finding your voice. Reading and finding those writers that have a great voice. There's a writer, a Pulitzer Prize winner, who's coming to Texas State named Adam Johnson, who wrote a novel called The Orphan Master's Son. If you guys want to read about North Korea and a really sort of crazy, violent novel that's right there with my novel lords as terms of really dark, read Adam Johnson's novel. It won a Pulitzer for a reason. And some people, a lot of Asians are criticizing it because Adam Johnson's a white guy and he wrote this novel and he won a Pulitzer and it's about North Korea. Well, there's a whole argument there, and if you read this novel, you will form an opinion of it. You will either think that he's a great writer, which I think he is. You may feel like it was a novel that he shouldn't have written, that somebody else should have. That's fine to have that opinion too. There's absolutely nothing wrong with your opinion. You just have to learn to form it, and you have to learn to say it, and it takes practice. Any other questions? Don't be bashful. Yes?
Throughout your lecture, you said, you kept saying, say the unsayable. And I mean, you didn't hold back about a lot, and I give you credit for that. I mean, it was a lot, and it's true. But would you also say that the next step would be to be unmovable, and if so, what would it be?
Oh boy.
Not just say it, but
Yeah.
how do we fix all that's wrong with the valley and everything that's wrong?
Well, I think the first step is something like this, is somebody inspiring somebody to do something. I think that's something our culture here in the Southern Valley, we have certain people who are doing things. We have Dolores Huerta and that whole legacy there, and Cesar Chavez and the whole legacy. But there are new legacies to be made through new leaders and so forth. And I think you're going to start to meet some of those through the Social Justice Institute. I'm hoping that some of those natural leaders are going to come out of the woodwork, and that there are going to be some things to rally behind. And it really takes a certain bravery not to be afraid of society. And that's kind of why I did this no hold back, kind of lecture, because I know it's going to be put on a website, and I know I'm going to get some negativity from people. Maybe some of yours wanting to be like, I wish I had brought a tomato and throw it at Nick's head right now. But at the same time, it's like, I don't know what you believe in. I don't know what you're passionate about. I brought up a whole wide range of things. I never see people protesting the oil refinery, but boy, would that really cause, a stink in society if you're protesting. If you literally, okay, let's look at oil, just oil refinery and oil factories for just 1 second. And we think of something like the styrene that's made, I don't know if it's still called Mobile Chemical, but if you start Googling styrene, styrofoam cups and styrofoam bowls, you're eating out of and whatever, and you start researching it, and you start seeing how all Americans have styrene in their body, and how much we have, and what it can do to the factory workers who get styrene in their body. And you start looking, okay, and then that's just one kind of factory in Bakersfield. I don't even know all the different kinds of food processing factories, so forth, factory farming. If you look at these factories, and if you were to drive around Bakersfield at night, and you might see from some of the factories these big clouds coming up because they know they can only get away with this at night. Well, why don't the media do anything about it? Why? Well, on the same token, why should we rely on the media to do anything about it when we are just as empowered as somebody with a puts on cake makeup and sits in a chair at 5 o'clock news, or the guy who drives around with a camera to catch footage for the 5 o'clock news? Maybe the media is too lazy to go park out there at 3 in the morning because they'd rather have their person standing by listening to the police radio because they know if it bleeds, it leads. It's like, man, there's gonna be a shooting somewhere, so be prepared for that. Let's not do some investigative reporting. People did that 30 years ago, right? We don't need to do that again. But the reality is we have to do these things again and again and again. And it's passionate people who have to bond over certain topics and decide for themselves, what do we want to fight against? What is worthy of a lot of people being outraged about? And I think that's where doing something, that becomes the next step. You're right. Is it speaking out and holding little news conferences about something like poison in the air and factories? Is it like holding those kinds of news conferences regularly? And then the next step is, there's this whole idea of organizing. That's something we can learn from Delano, California, is how to organize and protest and not to be afraid. If little Dolores Huerta and little Cesar Chavez, right? These people aren't giants, but they were and are giants, and taking police batons, right, for justice. And even just standing in front of you, I have to have a certain level of bravery to get against whatever reaction comes from speaking to this group of students in Delano. And that's what's so important to me personally is being here, being able to talk about my novel Lords, which there's an interesting thing there that, yeah, I probably could have organized some people to protest about that, but I think I've learned a lot from doing that 10 years ago, that maybe if I did that now, maybe I would do that, because what happened was the vice president of the Bakersfield Californian ended up telling me after he got fired that there was this big conversation at the Bakersfield Californian about my novel to say, hey, this book is newsworthy, but we're not going to talk about it because we want to control the information that goes out to people, and we don't want Nick telling the story. So, organizing, figuring out what you're passionate about, and then being active, doing it. Don't be the people in society who allow for the oppression to continue. Another question?
I have more of a comment about, than anything, being older and not from this area, from Chicago, a big city, where everybody can be who they are. I was very shocked when I first moved to the Central Valley about how the first thing people ask you is, what church do you go to? Or, those types of things. But I was lucky because I was exposed to a lot of stuff. And there's a word called propinquity, which means the average person lives and marries within 5 miles of where they're born. And so I think one of the most important things Nick said was you have to expose yourself. You have to leave your comfort zone and learn about lots of different types of people. Get out of the valley, go to places, challenge yourself so that you can see the variety of things of life there are in this world, so that whenever you do find your voice, it isn't necessarily narrow. It's more expansive, and it's, I think it's so essential.
Yeah, and I think I'm very much speaking to, trying to, my secret agenda is to trick you all into becoming writers, and because that's really important to me, and I find the southern Central Valley as being sort of backwards when it comes to literature and writers. And I look up to Fresno because they have an MFA program. They have so many poets. I have lots of writer friends, lots of essayists there. You even read the news in Fresno, and it's written in a better way because there's so many writers who are students of the craft of writing. And so that's one of the things that kind of applies to what you're saying over here, the doable, is I would love for more writers to come out. We've talked about, with the Social Justice Institute, you know, maybe an entire memoir program of, imagine if all of you wrote down one 10-page story about something that happened to you or your family. Now, what's the value of that if you talk amongst yourselves and those, you know, there's a value to that. But what about if you wrote it down? What about if you really refined that piece, if you really went through some really tough revisions in the craft of writing to write a wonderful, publishable story about something that happened to you or your family, your grandfather, your father, your brother, yourself. You know, maybe you're pulled over by a cop and you're pissed off about it because they're targeting you. That's a story. I remember my dad was addicted to gambling, and he was this little Mexican truck driver guy, and always carried a gun, and I'm like very different from my dad, you know, and we were going up to a pool hall in Vegas. I was visiting my dad, he lived there, and we were driving, and my dad had his cap on backwards, and he's a very dark-skinned Latino man. You see, I'm not like super dark-skinned unless I'm like trying to tan like Baywatch or something. But I was with my dad, and a cop pulls us over, and I automatically wanted to argue with the cop, and this had never happened with me and my father before, and my dad almost got scared. He was such a tough man, but he almost got scared, and he was like, "Son, don't say anything." And I was angry. But I shut up because he's my dad, right? Your dad says shut up, so you shut up. But that's just, I write down so many of my stories, you know, for a personal reason, for reasons of, you know, that whole purpose that I talked about. And that's something that, you know, I would love to trick more people into doing, because your story is valuable. I don't care who you are, you have a valuable story in you, and not just one. You've got probably like 10,000 valuable stories, and over your whole lifetime, you won't be able to write them all down. Any more questions?
Was it ever hard for you to write about yourself?
Was it ever hard for me to write about myself? I have this one memoir called Citrus Girl that I just finally, I was even tinkering with it yesterday. And originally I'd written this like 20 years ago. I went on this crazy adventure with, one of my sons is right here in that cap, Landon. Sorry, Landon, giving you a shout out, son. But I have an older boy named Jordan, and Jordan was 6 years old, and I was dating this gal from Ohio, and she was just like very counterculture bohemian, and she was like, hey, let's have this like crazy cross-country adventure, and we'll go stay, you know, my family's fighting over this house that's in the Cuyahoga woods, and we'll just go stay there in this house and for the summer. And I'm like, okay, take Jordan, we go off to Ohio, have crazy adventure. And she's like, I got this car too. And it's this like great car. We go to her aunt's property, and in this barn is this really shitty car. That's this 1984 Bonneville that doesn't even have an exhaust system on it. It's just horrible, and this is the car she wanted to drive across America with. I know I'm telling a long story to make a point here. So we take off across country, we had our fun in Ohio, and we get to New Mexico, and the car breaks down in a lightning storm. Car actually had a CB radio in it. This is 1996. Don't ask me why the car had a CB radio. I have no idea why. We get on the CB, and we're like, help! Jordan's in the back seat going, this is fun, Dad. This is freaking awesome. Look at the lightning. And so we hitchhike with some truckers. We get to this place called Klein's Corners. We had a AAA card. I don't know how we had a AAA card, but we had one. And then we had to hitchhike with some other truckers and go back to the car to wait for the AAA. And then when AAA comes, and we go to this town, Santa Rosa, where Rudolfo Anaya, who wrote Bless Me Ultima, grew up in that village there. And there's a beautiful, perfectly round, watery hole, an oasis It's like 80 feet deep, and it is the most pristine, beautiful place you've seen. And it's like, this is where freaking Coronado came and drank water, because, you know, there's Spanish had come into New Mexico that far. And so I wrote about that, like right after it happened. 1996, I wrote, it took me, you know, a couple of years, and I finished a draft of it and everything, and I wrote it, and I thought it was wonderful, and I shared it with John Maynard, and he's like, it's wonderful. And then over time I thought, this isn't wonderful, this is a piece of crap. And there's a reason why I thought it was a piece of crap, because it was really hard to write about, and what was hard to write about was the sex. Sorry, Landon. And I was terrified, to be honest, about things that happened in the car. And I was so embarrassed that it took me about 20 years to finally realize that this is why I have a problem with this piece of work, because I was afraid of telling an honest story from my life that actually women readers would be like, heck yeah, turning the pages, right? So it was my fiance, Jane, who's in the creative writing program at Texas State. She's graduating in a month, and she encouraged me, even though this was a story about an ex-girlfriend, she was like, write about the sex, dude, that's the best stuff, so write about it. And so I did, and I think it's a better work of art. Am I still terrified of it? Yeah. Oh yeah. I don't think I could read it to you guys. So yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Please join me in welcoming Nick.